Hi, my name is Arlette, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Jeffery Giesener. For those of you who are not familiar with his work, Jeffery created JCHR, Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance, to honor and pay tribute to the memory of his surviving parents. It's comprised of Jewish survivors, this group, and their children and grandchildren, and also people who lost their dear ones in the Holocaust, and basically anyone with an interest in Jewish topics. So, hi, Jeffery. We've known each other.
So good to see you again. And it's quite a switch that you're now turning the tables on me, and I'm going to be the one answering your questions, which I'm really excited about, because I think this is part one of creating my book about my family. And so you don't know it yet, but you're in the development stage of helping me write my own book through digital communications. So some of these interviews will be chapters of the book that I'm prepared to electronically write and edit electronically. So I didn't tell you that when I wrote to you. So welcome to my life. This is my life.
So you tricked me. Okay, I like. So even though we only met less than half a year ago, I feel like I've known you for years and years. You have that effect on people, feeling like they've known you for a long time because you always put people very much at ease. And one of the ways that you do that is to tell them about your story, and that makes them, motivated to share theirs. And it's a very relaxing atmosphere working with you. And I think you must have this effect on a lot of people. Do you agree?
I hope so. I mean, I've always been, I wouldn't consider myself an extrovert because I spend so much time online, but I do enjoy talking with people, and just the whole story of how I got into this is something interesting. So why don't I start there? I know you haven't asked me the question, but you kind of did. So my parents were both survivors. My mom and her family were survivors from Auschwitz. Unfortunately, not all of my mom's family survived. Well, the story really was my grandfather and my great-grandfather started a business, a glass making business in Košice, Czechoslovakia, which is outside of Prague. And it was called Guppa, G-U-P-P-A glass. And my great-grandfather was a very wealthy man and started that factory business. And it turned out to be a factory complex and adjacent to a railroad. My grandfather had quite an affluent life. He had 4 children, all girls from age 8. My mom was 15. My aunt Handy was 18, and my aunt Edith was 21 when they went into the camps. In 1941, the Nazis seized my grandfather's business, the Guppa glass business, and then subsequently rounded up 18,000 Jews from the Košice area and surrounding cities and deported them all into the Guppa glass as a way station for eventual transport to Auschwitz. And in May of 1945 and in April, those 18,000 people were all transported to Auschwitz, and the ghetto was liquidated. My mom and her family were deported in May of 1945. Unfortunately, when they arrived, Magda, who was only 8, the youngest, was ordered off the cattle car and was pointed to go to the left by Mengele. And my mom's mom wouldn't let go of her hand, and they both perished literally upon arrival in the crematorium, which I just can't wrap my head around that whole idea, because I can't imagine my mom and her sisters and her father realizing the smoke that was in the air was actually her mother and baby sister. It's just mind-boggling to me. My dad on the other side, oh, and one more thing, the 3 sisters didn't know anything about the whereabouts of their father, because he was immediately ordered to go into the men's lager, and they didn't know for the full year, and they were liberated in May of 45, whether he was alive or dead, and they only reconnected after liberation when they were all stumbling around looking for anybody they knew. And I can't imagine even what that was like. Unfortunately, I don't know anything about what I've just told you from my mother, because my mother obviously suffered tremendous trauma and never, ever would speak to us. My sister and I, my sister's 4 years older than I am. I'm 63 now. And she never, ever would speak about any of her experiences in the camp. She did speak a lot about growing up in an Orthodox home in Košice, Czechoslovakia, and all of the pleasures of being Orthodox and the rituals, and how her mother was a tremendous cook. But I know nothing out. We'll cover that a little later. You're not asking any questions, but that's okay. I'll just keep talking.
Well, I know that you spoke once about the deafening Shoah silence in your house, and I was wondering if your parents never spoke about it, especially your mother. How can you explain what you found out about the horrific war experiences?
Well, let me tell you, it's a great question, and I'm going to hold that for a second because I want to tell you a little bit about my father, and then I'll come back to how this all, how it all puts together. So my father, at only age 15, escaped Nazi Berlin in 1936 after the Nuremberg laws came about. His parents, my great-grandparents on my paternal side, had the foresight to realize what was going to happen and get my father out of Germany. My grandfather was a soldier of distinction in World War I, so my father did talk only in a life document that my sister forced my parents to write in 2008, when my parents were both in declining health, because she really wanted to archive their life experiences. My father spoke openly about his experiences. And so his father marched him literally right down to the front of the line of the Hadassah Aliyot Kindertransport, the very last one leaving Berlin. And he got on that Kindertransport, which went by train to Italy, and then on the ship Galilee to Port Haifa in Palestine. And he arrived in 1936. And he lived on Kibbutz Yagor and was sort of grew up alone, but grew up and was trained as a woodworker, master woodworker. And at 28, he fought in the War of Independence in 1948 in the Haganah Air Force, and he made propellers because he was a woodworker. He met my mom, who eventually decided that Košice wasn't for her. My grandfather had lost, as I said, his wife in the camps, so he remarried. My mom just couldn't handle the remarriage, and so she decided that she would leave. And her middle sister decided to leave as well. She went to Buenos Aires, got married there. And I have two first cousins in Buenos Aires. And Edith decided to stay in Czechoslovakia. And she had two children who escaped Czechoslovakia when the Russians came to power and took over Czechoslovakia in the 60s. And my first cousin, lives in Aachen, Germany. Now, to answer your question, since I didn't know any of what my parents would have happened during the war, I actually was traumatized, and I never really wanted to know about my mom's experiences either. Even though my parents never talked to me about their experiences, I can remember back to the 5th grade that when my teacher, and I don't know why he did this, he was a male, he separated the good kids from the bad kids, and the good kids got seats in the front and the bad kids got seats in the back. I don't know if there was some anti-Semitism there, but I lived in a very Jewish community, and the school was only a block away from the house, so my mom would walk me to school, but I refused to go to school. And I cried and cried and cried. And I remember this to as well as it was like yesterday. And mom would literally have to drag me to school, and I had to speak to the principal, who she became very friendly with. And she didn't convince the teacher to do anything different, but she forced me to stay there. The next time I remember doing anything with having any experiences is I noticed my mom removed her tattoo on her left arm. And I tried to ask her about it, and she didn't discuss it. She wouldn't discuss it. She just said she had a bad accident. And then when I was bar mitzvah age, I can remember having to be trained, and part of the training was to go to synagogue on Saturdays. And there was a real difference in philosophy of Judaism between my parents. My father during Pesach would say, Baruch atah Adonai, let's eat. And my mom would spend a week and a half preparing the kanedla, the table, the linens, the brisket, every possible thing that she could remember that her mom made. And by the way, my mom never used a recipe, which is a full story in itself. We'll cover that too. But when I was at bar mitzvah age, my mom eventually met my father in Israel. She was very successful in Israel. She opened up a beauty salon, which was very successful. And she had bought this very heavy gold bracelet that was really, really thick gold. And she used to wear it all the time. I don't know what, I never could ask her why or what the story behind that was. But I would always go and sit to the left of mom for lessons, and I would play around with that bracelet with my finger. Well, one reason, I don't know why I did this, but one day I moved from playing around with that bracelet to my mom's, touching my mom's tattoo. And if a mom could give dagger eyes, and I know, Arlette, you would know what I'm talking about. It's like those piercing eyes that go right through you without your mother saying a word. I literally was like frozen. And from then on, I refused to ever read a Holocaust book, watch a film. I couldn't watch Hogan's Heroes. I couldn't go to any memorial for Shoah events. I was completely uninterested in the Shoah. So one has to come to the conclusion is, what the heck am I doing running two groups that are focused on the Holocaust? Well, there's a really good story there too. So
let me interrupt you for 1 second. What was the connection with your trauma at school and your trauma afterwards? You were, the teacher had the bad kids in the back, you were crying, and then how did that connect to your trauma?
I think it was the first time that I think I had trauma that I could remember.
Okay.
And I may have associated the good kids with the bad kids to being segregated like my mother was off the train. And who knows how all this works in the mind, right? But something impacted me. I definitely knew my mother was in the Holocaust. I definitely knew she was in Auschwitz growing up at that age when I was in 5th grade.
Right.
But I didn't know what all that meant. But I knew, and I knew
when
that. When
you touched her arm, was it the tattoo or was it the scar of the tattoo?
I touched her tattoo. I actually touched the scar of her tattoo.
The scar. Okay.
And so when so the question is, how does this all kind of, so in 2020 or 2019, I retired at 58 in 2016. I have a career-long, been successful building startup and technology businesses. And I sold my last technology business in 2016 and retired. Myra has been a career-long Jewish professional, and she was the interim CEO of the Minneapolis Jewish Federation here in the United States. And she had spent 5 years working in senior roles. She was a COO, CFO, and then became the interim CEO. When they hired—
Just to clarify, you want to mention who she is? This is your wife, right?
This is my wife, Myra, and we've been married. Today, actually, on June 8th of 2022 is our 36th wedding anniversary. So
Mazel tov.
thank you. It's amazing that she's lasted with me. She's an absolute angel, having to deal with my stuff for 36 years. Plus, we used to work with each other before we got married. So we say we have 6 more years on top of the 36.
Wow.
But officially they don't count, but they maybe
Right.
unofficially we're 42. So Myra retires in 2019, and we decide to come to San Diego. And when we came to San Diego, USA, California, we didn't know anybody at all.
Mhm.
And Myra wanted to access the Jewish world here. And the first thing she wanted to do was to get back into the Federation of San Diego and to meet as many Jewish people so we can have Jewish friends here. Well, we came to one of the events, which I didn't want to go to, but Myra pushed me to go. And that's where this introverted world comes from. She wanted to go to the Jewish Community Center, who was having a Shabbat service and a guest lecturer. And so we lived in an area called Bakersfield in San Diego. And it's La Jolla, where the JCC was. It's about a good 40 minutes drive, but in California, it could be an hour and a half with the traffic. So we left early, and there was another woman who was coming from Carlsbad, California, which is north of San Diego and La Jolla. And she left early too, and just so happened there wasn't a lot of traffic, and we both were sitting on a bench next to each other. She was knitting. We were sitting there just talking to each other. And Myra can talk to the lampposts. So immediately she starts asking what she's knitting. And all of a sudden, talking. I was ignored completely. I was out of the picture. And they started to have a tremendous relationship. And Freddie Packier is really now a family member of ours, though not blood family, but certainly family love. And Freddie asked Myra if one of us was a second-gen survivor, like she was. And Myra said she wasn't, but she pointed to me. And I said, I'm a second-gen survivor. And she said, I knew it. I knew, Jeff, that you were second-gen. I said, what do you mean? I have a horn growing out of my head? Well, how do you know that I'm a second-gen survivor? She said, there is something about you that I could feel inside of me that you were second-gen, which was kind of an interesting concept. And then she invited us to go to a second-gen Shoah group, which is a social group that she belongs to. And there's 125 members, all second generation here in San Diego. And I should say, in San Diego, there are 500 survivors still living here, which is amazing. And
Yeah.
the weather has a lot to do with why they're here. But just as we chose the weather here. So I said I didn't want to go. And I took Myra aside and I said, Myra, I can't go to this. I just can't deal with the trauma of the Holocaust. And Myra said, you got to put on your big boy pants and finally get over this. We're going. And she forced me to go. And it's literally changed my life to a much positive perspective. I met people who talked, their parents talked. I met people whose parents didn't talk. I met people who openly discussed that they had trauma inherited from their parents and what that was. I met, I have no relatives here in the United States other than my sister. And would you believe that, here's a funny story. Freddie introduces me to Ava Sakarian, and Ava asked me, oh, where's your parents? Where are your parents from? And I said, my mom was from Košice, Czechoslovakia. And she looks at me strangely and she calls her sister over, Ida Epstein, where was mom's born? And Ida says to Ava, you know where mom's born. She was born in Košice, Czechoslovakia. And I said, what? Košice, Czechoslovakia? I said, what was their last name? My mom's last name was Friedman. And Ida calls Henry over, her younger brother. And so all three of them are talking to myself and Myra. And Ida says, Henry, what was mom's maiden name? He says, Ida, you know what mom's maiden name? It was Friedman. And I said, Friedman, I said, we're mishpacha. I have no mishpacha in the United States. And whether we're blood related or not, I am telling you that we are now related. And you know, from 2019, when we first met, that we now meet regularly and enjoy milestone events. We communicate. Obviously, COVID has dampened that tremendously. But I now have 3 relatives and family here in San Diego that I never knew I had. And what's interesting is that everybody that I meet in the group who has the name Friedman, I make a special point to reach out to them to see if they're from Košice, Czechoslovakia. And the story behind Košice, Czechoslovakia and the Friedman family is that my great-grandfather's father was a rabbi. And he had a number of wives during who knows when, and something like an umpteen number of children who spread the Friedman name all over Košice. So there are a lot of Friedmans from Košice around the world. And in fact, in Allentown, where I was born and where Mom eventually came and Dad in '54 from Israel, there was a very close friend that Mom knew from Košice living in Allentown, which is really bizarre. And that friend taught me bar mitzvah lessons. Really.
And how big was this town that your mother's from? How many people were there?
I don't know, but there was 18,000 Jews from around the area, so it was pretty big. So coming back, the story continues. So I go to this meeting. I realized the first time. Now I want to also tell you that in 2008, as I mentioned, my sister forced my parents to dictate to them a life document. She had recorded it. She had then transposed it into the computer. And in 2008, she sent me the files, one from my father and one from my mother. And unfortunately, because of my trauma, I never opened the file. I couldn't bring myself to read what my mother and my father would say in those files. But that night in 2019, I couldn't sleep. I was so exhilarated from knowing that I wasn't going crazy with my trauma.
Which I'd like to interrupt, Jeffrey. Can you backtrack and explain what your trauma was? We know the story of the tattoo, and then we jump ahead to this. What happened in between?
So all along my business career, I had ups and downs like anybody else who's creating businesses from scratch. And I've had luckily more ups and downs, but when I had downers in talent cycles in business, invariably I would have the same dream. I would wake up in the middle of the night with an absolutely clear picture, and it was always the same dream, of being interrogated under a bright, hot light by the Gestapo in a Gestapo prison. And it was so bad that in the middle of the night on some of these dreams, I would wake up in such a sweat that I have to get out of bed and take a shower. And so I've been dreaming those nightmares my whole professional career, ever since 18 years old in college. Maybe once or twice a year, but whenever I was in a downstroke, boom, just like that, I had the nightmare. And it would repeat until I could work myself out of that nightmare. And
this is why you never watched movies and you never read books about the Holocaust?
That was another reason why I never watched any movies or anything else. So,
your sister brings the life story, the interview.
So that night, as I came back and exhilarated, and I realized that, hey, these nightmares are not unique to me. Half the audience of the 50 second generators who were in attendance and the other spouse who was not typically a second gen, they, of the 50 second geners, probably 10 or 15 had nightmares too. Each were different, but I realized then it wasn't me and I was not alone. Where all these years I was going crazy. And even if I went into therapy because I was seeking help for getting over these down times, when the therapist or the psychologist or the psychiatrist would tell me, let me hear a little bit more about your mother's Holocaust. I said, give me a break. What I have has nothing to do with the Holocaust. And if you're going to charge me $400 an hour, I'm not sitting here and talking to you about my mom's survivor, which I don't know anything about anyway. So and if that went down the path, I found a new therapist, honestly. But I have been in therapy a lot of my life, and I didn't understand why, right? So all of this side of this one big bundle of nuttiness, right? And when I came home from that meeting, and it was the middle of the night, and I couldn't sleep, and I was saying, God, I wasn't alone. It was the first time that I sat in my computer. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and I opened both my mother's document, life document, and my father's life document. And in between 2011 and 2009, my sister was doing research because she obviously read the document right away. And so she was applying primary research that she had online to fill in gaps that were in that document. And then she would send me new releases, but I would never open any of those files either. But I opened the latest version in 2019, and I read my dad's full life document, which was really how I learned about my father's story. And what I articulated today, there's much more, but there's another part of the story, which I'll get to in a minute. But what was fascinating about mom is mom in that document did not discuss 1944 to 1945 at all.
And that's the year that she was in Auschwitz?
Those were the years which she was deported in May of 1944. She was released she was liberated in May of 1945. There was nothing in there. I heard about the fun things that she did growing up. I heard about bad things, like her dog there was an anti-Semitic neighbor who didn't like them having dogs, and they actually threw scalding hot water on the dog and killed the dog. That was in the life document, but it was prior to that, she could say. But it was fascinating to read both of these documents, and it started me on a new pathway to want to know more. But I didn't have the wherewithal to figure out how to know more. And that's an interesting story also. And so when COVID hit, because of our I was invited, and Meyer was invited to join the second generation group. We became members, and they asked us to join this steering group because we were the youngest members of the group. Most of the group are in late 60s, all of them in the 70s, and some of you are in the 80s. And so when COVID hit, one of the really disasters for the whole world was, how does nonprofit organizations connect with their constituents? Because you couldn't meet in person anymore. And so Meyer and I, because we had technology expertise, and because I use webinars to sell technology, and then Zoom came out of nowhere, and I said, wow, we could use Zoom, and we can put all the programming, the Yiddish Club, the book club, the Bunko Club, on Zoom for the second generation group here in San Diego. And that's what we did. And it was immediately positive connection, because during COVID, we kept the programming going on a month-to-month basis. And so our second generation group stayed together. And still today, even after 2.5 years of COVID, we now still have the same membership that we had before. And we still have a Yiddish club, which meets this weekend. We still have a book club. And what was another funny part of this whole story.
Before you begin, I have so many questions, but I hate to interrupt you, but an important one. Your mother had skipped that important year at Auschwitz, or year and a half. Did your sister ask her directly about it when it was missing? No.
Yes, she did, but she wouldn't answer.
She refused to answer. She changed the subject, or she just said no?
In fact, it's interesting because my first cousin on my dad's side lives in Edgware, England. And his younger brother, Horst, Giesener, which when he went to, he got out with his mother and my grandmother were able to get out of Germany in 1939 before the war on a work transfer pass to Manchester, England.
Right.
She was very highly educated. She was working in a dentist's office, but then unfortunately, the only work she could get was to house clean for a Jewish family in Manchester. My dad's younger brother, Horst, had to change his name and he became Harry Gilbert. And he went to immediately when he went, and he was only, my father was 15 in 1936. That means he was 4 years younger, so he was 11, add 4 more years, he was 15. So he was 15 only when he went to England. But as a German Jew, he was immediately interned in Australia. So but what happened is that my first cousin, who also doesn't want to have anything to do with the Holocaust, just said to me, take this Shoah tape and don't bother me. Everything about my uncle is on the Shoah tape. So I reviewed the Shoah tape just when I started to learn about what about the Holocaust. He revealed everything I needed to know about his growing up with my father and his grandmother. And unfortunately, my grandfather and my grandmother were divorced in the late 1920s, which for Germany and being Jewish, that was something really, and that's a whole set of traumas because my grandfather unfortunately bet all of their money on the ponies. He also had a good job, he had a career, but every bit of money that he made, he bet on the ponies. So when I grew up with my father used to say, I can't give you money to do this or that, because when I was growing up, I never had any money from my father. And my father spent all the money we had on the horses.
The horses, yeah.
So so if you think I can put a quarter in a gambling slot machine, never gonna happen. I never have gone to a racetrack. And if I've gone to a racetrack, it was just to look. I could never bet on a horse. Not even $1.
How about a nickel, Jeff?
No.
Jeffrey, a nickel.
I can't put a quarter in the slot machine. I swear to God, I turned into a sweat. I started breaking out in a sweat. That was my father. That was my father inheriting his trauma, his survivor trauma to me. If you really think about it. So,
and did your sister have any trauma?
Yes, she has lots of stomach issues as well. She has lots of stomach issues. And, I haven't had the courage really to sit down, which sounds really, I'm thanking you for giving me this idea. I really should sit down with my sister and ask her about if she experienced any trauma growing up. I have never asked my sister, so you're giving me a great idea, Phil. Thank you. So I open up these files, and
I think our 30 minutes might be up, Jeffrey.
Okay, well let's cut it here and let's do episode 2.
Yes.
In a minute. Okay, great.
Oh, okay.
You're listening.
Bye-bye.
You're listening to the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group, and I'm switching seats here, and I'm being interviewed by Arlette. So this is episode 1. Why don't you come back for episode 2? I think you'll enjoy it.